And joining me now is a key Trump ally, Republican Congresswoman Elise Stefanik of New York, who chairs the House Republican Conference, making her the highest-ranking woman in congressional GOP leadership. She is also the youngest woman ever to serve in elected congressional leadership. Congresswoman Stefanik, welcome to Meet the Press.
Great to be with you, Kristen.
Thank you so much for being here. I want to start by talking about 2024, some of what we've heard over the past 48 hours. Obviously, President Biden officially kicking off his campaign against former President Trump, who's the strong frontrunner. You are one of Trump's strongest supporters. In his speech, President Biden cast the former president as a threat to democracy. This was an argument that was effective in 2020. It was a winning argument for Democrats in 2022. How do you answer that charge?
Well, first, Kristen, I wouldn't say it's a winning argument. In fact, in 2022, Democrats lost the House, and House Republicans ran on the issues that matter to the American people. We ran on securing the border. We ran on addressing the historic inflation, which the American people know is a result of Joe Biden's failed policies and the trillions of dollars of reckless spending. And what Joe Biden didn't mention in his speech were any of the policies that have created a crisis across America. So zero mention of the border, which is wide open and a top issue even in my home state in New York. You have Democrat mayors who are speaking out about Joe Biden's border crisis. No mention of inflation, which continues to be a concern for voters across my district. And when it comes to threats to democracy, Joe Biden and Democrats are a threat to democracy. We see them attempting to remove President Trump from the ballot. We saw this in Colorado and Maine. That is a suppression of the American people and the American people's ability to cast their ballots this November. So it's Democrats that are a threat to democracy.
We should note, of course, there's no evidence that President Biden is in any way coordinating with the Justice Department in terms of the indictments against former President Trump. But staying on this issue of January 6th, because of course Mr. Trump was talking about this as well. This weekend we did mark the 3-year anniversary, and I want to pause for a minute and play some of the comments that you made on the evening of that day. Let's take a look.
This has been a truly tragic day for America. Americans will always have the freedom of speech and the constitutional right to protest, but violence in any form is absolutely unacceptable. It is anti-American and must be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law.
In terms of what we're hearing today, former President Trump has referred to January 6th as a, quote, beautiful day. Just this weekend, he referred to some of those who are serving time for having stormed the Capitol as, quote, hostages. Do you still feel as though that day was tragic and that those who were responsible should be held responsible to the fullest extent of the law?
Well, first of all, Kristen, as typical for NBC and the biased media, you played one excerpt of my speech. I stand by my comments that I made on the House floor. I stood up for election integrity, and I challenged and objected to the certification of the state of Pennsylvania because of the unconstitutional overreach. So I absolutely stand by my floor speech. I am proud to support President Trump, and I want to correct another statement you made that there is no coordination with Joe Biden and the Department of Justice in prosecutions against President Trump. We just saw Hunter Biden defy a congressional subpoena and the White House admitting it was in coordination with Joe Biden the morning of. That is coordination, and I believe that Joe Biden will be found to be the most corrupt president in our nation's history, and that's why all of the investigative work that we're doing is so important, because the American people, they deserve transparency and accountability.
A lot to unpack there. Of course, the White House has said that Hunter Biden is acting unilaterally on the issue of election integrity, though. As you know, Trump took his case to court more than 60 times that there was fraud. He didn't win. But I want to get back to this key question. Do you still think it was a tragic day? Do you think that the people who stormed the Capitol should be held responsible to the full extent of the law?
I have concerns about the treatment of January 6 hostages. I have concerns. We have a role in Congress of oversight over our treatments of prisoners. And I believe that we're seeing the weaponization of the federal government against not just President Trump, but we're seeing it against conservatives. We're seeing it against Catholics. And that's one of the reasons why I'm so proud to serve on the Select Committee on the Weaponization of the Government, because the American people want answers answers. They want transparency. And they understand that as you look across this country, there seems to be two sets of rules. If your last name is Clinton or it's Biden, you get to live by a different set of rules than if you're an everyday patriotic American. I've been clear, Kristen, if you go back and play the full speech I gave on the House floor, I condemn the violence, just like I condemn the violence of the BLM riots, but I also importantly stood for election integrity and security of our elections, which if we don't have that, we do not have a democracy. So the real threat to our democracy is these baseless witch hunt investigations and lawsuits against President Trump, whether it's Tish James or whether we see in the D.C. Circuit Court. And that is undemocratic, and it's shredding our Constitution. And you know who agrees with me, Kristen? The American people. That's why President Trump is winning in poll after poll against Joe Biden.
The Justice Department has indicted a number of top-name Democrats as well, including the president's son, twice. So, I mean, a lot of critics would argue that undercuts your argument. There are two systems of justice.
If you want to try to, I want to answer that. If you want to make that case, the American people are very smart. They know that they tried to give Hunter Biden a sweetheart deal. We've heard from multiple IRS.
He's been indicted twice, Congresswoman.
But it was because of a judge that threw out a sweetheart deal that was negotiated on Joe Biden's behalf. Joe Biden and the Department of Justice have been withheld from going after the Biden crime family, which Joe Biden sits atop of.
Other top Democrats have been indicted as well, but we have a lot to get to, so I want to stay on track. You mentioned Pennsylvania. Would you vote to certify, and will you vote to certify, the results of the 2024 election, no matter what they show?
Well, I voted not to certify the state of Pennsylvania because, as we saw in Pennsylvania and other states across the country, that there was unconstitutional acts circumventing the state legislature and unilaterally changing election law.
What about 2024? What about 2024?
We will see if this is a legal and valid election. What we're seeing so far is that Democrats are so desperate, they're trying to remove President Trump from the ballot. That is a suppression of the American people, and the Supreme Court is taking that case up in February. That should be a 9-0 to allow President Trump to appear on the ballot, because that's the American people's decision to make this November.
And the matter is, of course, halted pending that appeal, as you say. But just to be very clear, I don't hear you committed to certifying the election results. Will you only commit to certify the results if former President Trump wins? Does that mean if former President Trump wins?
No, it means if they are constitutional. What we saw in 2020 was unconstitutional circumventing of the Constitution, not going through state legislatures when it comes to changing election law. And we're seeing this in my home state of New York, Kristen. We are seeing Democrats try to steal the election and illegally gerrymander congressional districts that we fairly won and are fair line. So I see this at a very local level, as well as the unconstitutional overreach we saw at the national level in 2020.
I want to move on to the university presidents, but just to put a fine point on this, Mr. Trump, his allies did take their case, their concerns about the election to court more than 60 times. They lost every time. Mr. Trump hired 2 independent firms to investigate that. They came up short, as well as the federal agency responsible for overseeing election security, CISA, said that the 2020 election was the most secure in American history. But let's move on to the university
presidents. Well, let me make
a
final point, and I think it's important because the American people understand that it was not a fair election. We had unconstitutional overreach, and that was why I objected to certain states when it came to my constitutional responsibility as a member of Congress. I'm going to always stand up for the Constitution and make sure that we have strong election integrity. And the real threat to democracy is Joe Biden and Democrats who are attempting to remove President Trump from the ballot, because Joe Biden knows he can't win at the ballot box.
Again, there's no evidence of coordination between Biden and DOJ. But let's talk about the university presidents, because, of course, the president of Harvard, Claudine Gay, resigned this week after this exchange that went viral that you had with her, the other presidents of some of the top universities, in which you pressed them on their response to anti-Semitic speech on campuses. Let's take a look.
And Dr. Gay, at Harvard, does calling for the genocide of Jews violate Harvard's rules of bullying and harassment? Yes or no?
It can be, depending on the context.
Now, of course, she was criticized for that response. She has since come under some scrutiny for allegations of plagiarism. She's resigned amidst all of that. What was your reaction when you learned she was resigning?
It was long overdue. She should have resigned immediately following the hearing. And of course, this follows the resignation of Liz McGill, the Penn president, who also answered almost verbatim the same way that the Harvard former president did as well. And so did the MIT president, I might add, and I've called for all three of their resignations. It's not just me who called for the resignations. We passed a vote bipartisan who called for the resignation on the floor of Congress. But I want to take you a little bit into that hearing, Kristen. That was the last question of the hearing, and I tried to structure the question in a way that was a moral question and not political. And it was a moral question. And I was expecting them to answer yes. And I was astonished in real time that they said it depends on the context. You put up three of my constituents, a farmer, a manufacturer, and a suburban mom. They know how to answer the question correctly. It was the most morally bankrupt testimony I've heard ever in Congress. And that's why it's the most viewed testimony ever.
Let me let you respond to what Claudine Gay has written in the New York Times. She says the campaign against me was about more than one university and one leader. This was merely a single skirmish in a broader war to unravel public faith in pillars of American society. Is she right? How do you respond to her?
Well, I would respond that she failed to stand up for Jewish students on campus who have been facing anti-Semitic attacks, who have been facing physical assaults. We've seen that footage. We've heard that directly from students on campus. We've also heard faculty concerns about her tenure and her position and her lack of academic integrity. But it really goes back to protecting Jewish students. And frankly, when it comes to Harvard, the only time that Harvard has pled for academic freedom or freedom of speech was when it comes to the genocide of the Jewish people. That is inherently unfit for a person to be president of a university. It is part of a broader issue at these schools, which is why our investigation is so important. We're going to look at DEI, which inherently has refused to bring up concerns from Jewish students of the rise of anti-Semitic attacks. We're going to look at foreign funding as well as taxpayer funding and the governance of these universities. You saw that these boards doubled down to support these university professors despite the morally bankrupt testimony.
I want to ask you, you talk about moral clarity. I want to ask you about something that former President Trump recently said. He referred to migrants as, quote, poisoning the blood of our country. This is language that the Biden campaign, others, says, quote, is parroting Adolf Hitler. Are you comfortable with former President Trump's comments?
Well, yet again, we have the media, which is so biased, which is reiterating whatever the talking points the Biden campaign is giving.
I'm giving you the opportunity to respond. I'm just giving you the opportunity to respond.
Our border crisis is poisoning Americans through fentanyl. It is poisoning people, including in my district, who are dying from overdoses of fentanyl. And you know why? Because of Joe Biden's wide open border, that executive actions he took on day one. So yes, I stand by President Trump. And President Trump also has he has the strongest record when it comes to supporting the Jewish people and supporting the state of Israel, whether you look at the historic Abraham Accords or whether you look at the ability for Jewish students to sue and stand up for equal treatment at schools under the Title VI executive order that President Trump put into place, not Joe Biden.
And again, I just want allowing you to respond to what has been said, because you are one of former President Trump's staunchest defenders. What do you say to your critics who've argued that you're holding the presidents of these universities to a higher standard than former President Trump?
These university presidents answered the question, does calling for the genocide of Jews violate your university's code of conduct? They said it depends on the context, and even in the case of the Penn president, they said it would have to take a step towards conduct. Though that testimony speaks for itself, it was morally bankrupt. It was viewed by over 1 billion people in less than a week. And when you are the president of these universities, you need to show moral leadership as well as academic leadership, and they have absolutely failed. And what was interesting, Kristen, is they did not even realize in the moment. What you can't see in that hearing in the video is there were Jewish students from each of those schools. And from our vantage point where I was seated, they were physically shaken by those answers. So they're unfit to be those presidents, and these schools need to do a lot of soul searching to make sure that they have morally fit leaders as university presidents, which is why our investigation is important.
And you've talked about, again, just on this issue of moral clarity, are you applying the same standards to your own party?
Absolutely. House Republicans stand strongly when it comes to condemning anti-Semitism. And let's be clear, Kristen, over 100 Democrats in the House voted against condemning anti-Semitism, whereas it got universal support among House Republicans. When we put the resolution on the floor calling for their resignation, House Republicans voted in support of that, and so did a fair number of Democrats, but there were a number of Democrats who did not vote in support of it. The rise in anti-Semitism is an issue on the left, and you know who hasn't spoken out loudly and clearly calling for the resignation of those presidents was Joe Biden.
The White House did speak out very firmly against the statements.
But Joe Biden did not. It did not come from Joe Biden.
The White House did
Doug
immediately
Emhoff, the second gentleman,
yes,
for speaking out, and the press secretary did, but the President of the United States did not. And he was a teacher at Penn. And he could have spoken out, and he should have spoken out.
Let's talk very quickly about what's happening on Capitol Hill. As you know, the Senate locked in these fierce negotiations over the border and border security. Congresswoman, if they reach a deal on border security that the House does not believe goes far enough, are you prepared to shut down the government over that?
Well, let's take a step back, Kristen. It is Joe Biden who would rather shut down the government than secure the border. Joe Biden and Chuck Schumer in the Senate have failed to take up our Secure the Border Act, which we passed. It has strong policies returning to the very effective border security policies of President Trump, including construction of a border wall, ending catch and release, returning to remain in Mexico. And the Senate negotiations are ongoing. We will see what they produce, but it needs to be real border security policies that we know work, which did under the Trump administration. Joe Biden has failed to take that up, and so has the Senate.
Very quickly, are you ruling out supporting a government shutdown, something that you've said
we don't support shutting down the government, but we must secure the border. We must secure the border. That's where the American people are. We're losing our country in front of our very eyes. And again, I take it to my home state in New York. Every state across the country is a border state. So the person who's threatening a government shutdown is Joe Biden, who refuses to secure the border. And again, you have Democrats like in New York City speaking out about this Biden border crisis.
Before I let you go, I have to talk to you about your future. Former President Trump, in his interview with me, said he, quote, likes the concept of picking a woman as his vice president. If called upon, would you serve as his vice president?
Well, I, of course, would be honored to serve in any capacity in a Trump administration. I'm proud to be the first member of Congress to endorse his reelection. I'm proud to be a strong supporter of President Trump, and he's going to win this November.
Have you spoken to the former president about the possibility of running as his VP pick?
I'm not going to get into the content of my conversation with President Trump. I talk to him frequently. We've been focused on winning. There's so much work to do as the House Republican Conference Chair, as the representative for New York's 21st Congressional District, and we need to make sure that President Trump is in the strongest position to win in the general election. That's what I've been focused on, and that's what I'm going to remain focused on.
Just to put a very fine point on it, it sounds like you're saying if he were to ask you, the answer would be yes?
Well, I've said for a year now I'd be honored to serve in the next Trump administration, but I'm focused on doing my job right now, which is a really important role as the conference chair and as, most importantly, the representative for the people of New York 21.
Congresswoman Chairwoman Elise Stefanik, thank you very much. Thanks for being here in person. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.